three words older women use to attract any avoidant instantly. But what nobody tells you is that it was never really about the words themselves. It was about the silence behind them, the calm behind the voice, and the emotional control behind the message that makes an avoidant man stop, hesitate, and suddenly feel something he's been running from his entire life: closeness without pressure. Because here's the uncomfortable truth most people never figure out in time. Avoidants don't fall for intensity. They retreat from it. And the harder you try to be seen, the faster they disappear. And yet there is a subtle shift, something so small it almost feels invisible, that completely changes how they respond. Not because you convinced them, not because you chased them, but because you stopped feeding the exact emotional pattern they were used to escaping. And before we go deeper, if this is the kind of psychological breakdown you're into, make sure you subscribe, because what you're about to hear isn't just dating advice, it's behavioral psychology most people only learn after they've already lost the connection. Now here's where things start to get interesting. Most people assume attraction is built through effort, more messages, deeper explanations, emotional honesty at the wrong time, but with avoidant attachment styles, effort often translates as pressure, and pressure translates as distance. It's almost like trying to hold water tighter. The more force you apply, the faster it slips through your fingers. Avoidants are wired in a way where emotional closeness triggers a subtle internal alarm, not because they don't care, but because their system equates dependency with danger. So when someone comes in with emotional intensity, long paragraphs, or constant reassurance seeking, what the avoidant actually feels isn't love growing, it's space shrinking. And the natural response to shrinking space is withdrawal, not connection. This is why so many connections that start with chemistry end in confusion, because one person is moving forward with emotion while the other is quietly stepping back just to breathe. But there's a pattern older, more emotionally grounded individuals tend to understand without even realizing they're doing it. It's not manipulation, it's regulation. It's the ability to stay present without overreaching, to respond without chasing, and to communicate without emotional flooding. This creates something rare in an avoidance world: safety without expectation. And safety is the one thing they don't run from. They run from demand, from pressure, from the feeling that they are about to be emotionally consumed. But when they sense calm consistency, something shifts internally. They don't feel trapped, they feel curious. And curiosity is the first doorway back into connection. That's where the idea of the three-word shift begins to matter. Not because the words themselves are magical, but because of what they remove from the interaction. They remove emotional chasing. They remove over-explaining. They remove the subtle desperation that most people don't even realize is leaking through their messages. It's not about what is added, it's about what is taken away. And when communication becomes light, grounded, and emotionally neutral, the avoidant nervous system stops interpreting the interaction as a threat and starts reevaluating it as something safe enough to re-engage with. That is the turning point most people miss, because they are too focused on being understood rather than being energetically felt. And here's where older emotional intelligence plays a powerful role. With experience comes restraint, and with restraint comes presence. There's a quiet strength in not reacting immediately, in not needing to fill every silence, in not turning every moment into a conversation that proves something. That kind of energy changes everything in how it's received. Because when an avoidant encounters someone who is not trying to pull them in, not trying to fix them, not trying to define the connection too early, something unexpected happens. They lower their guard slightly, not because they were convinced, but because they were not pressured. And in that small gap of emotional space, curiosity begins to grow where resistance used to be. And once that curiosity appears, everything begins to shift in a way most people completely misread in real time. Because from the outside, it still looks like distance, still looks like mixed signals, still looks like emotional inconsistency, but internally something very different is happening. The avoidant is no longer just protecting themselves. They are now observing you. And observation is the first stage of emotional re-entry. Not engagement, not confession, not sudden vulnerability, just quiet mental tracking of how you respond, how you behave when they pull back, how you carry yourself when they don't immediately return energy. This is where most people collapse the dynamic, because instead of staying steady, they start overcompensating again, trying to secure the connection, unknowingly resetting the entire cycle back to pressure. But when the energy stays unchanged, something unfamiliar begins to form in the avoidant mind. Uncertainty about their usual script. This is where emotional neutrality becomes powerful in a way that feels almost invisible. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists as a lack of emotional spikes. No sudden escalation, no dramatic reaction, no chasing energy disguised as concern. And for an avoidant, who is used to relationships rising quickly into emotional intensity or collapsing into frustration, neutrality feels like a pattern interrupt. It doesn't trigger their escape response in the same way, because nothing is trying to capture them. Instead, they are met with space, consistent, calm, unpressured space. And in that space, something begins to loosen internally, not because they feel emotionally safe in a romantic sense yet, but because they are not being emotionally cornered. Now, this is where the second layer of the shift begins to reveal itself more clearly. When emotional neutrality is sustained, the avoidant starts to reinterpret the interaction through a different lens. Instead of "this person needs something from me," the subconscious begins to ask, "why aren't they reacting like everyone else?" And that question is far more powerful than attraction at first, because attraction requires certainty, but curiosity thrives on unpredictability. And for someone who is used to predictable emotional outcomes, either pursuit or conflict, this unpredictability becomes mentally sticky. They don't fully engage, but they also don't fully detach. They hover in between, which is the exact psychological space where attachment begins to form without them realizing it. And this is where the idea of controlled detachment language starts to matter on a deeper level. It is not coldness, it is not emotional withdrawal used as punishment, it is the art of staying present without over-investing your emotional state into the outcome. It sounds simple, but it changes everything. Because when you stop over-explaining your presence, when you stop reinforcing your value through constant reassurance, when you stop trying to manage how you are perceived, the interaction stops feeling like a negotiation. It becomes something lighter, something less predictable, something the avoidant doesn't feel the need to escape from immediately. And in that reduced pressure environment, they start to re-engage on their own terms. Not because they were pulled, but because they were no longer being pushed away by intensity. And now we reach the part where everything subtly converges into what this entire dynamic was building toward. The actual three-word shift doesn't land as a trick. It lands as a reflection of everything that has already changed in your energy. Because at this stage, the words are no longer carrying desperation. They are carrying detachment. They are no longer trying to hold the connection in place. They are simply acknowledging reality without emotional weight. And that is where their impact comes from. The same sentence that once might have sounded like emotional pursuit now sounds like calm finality. Not rejection, not anger, just emotional precision. And that precision is what interrupts the avoidant's internal expectation of being chased or pressured. What happens next is not immediate romance or sudden vulnerability. It is recalibration. The avoidant begins to mentally reprocess the connection because the emotional environment they expected is no longer present. The usual triggers are missing. The usual patterns are broken. And in that disruption, they are forced to engage differently, even if only internally at first. They start thinking more, analyzing more, and reaching out in smaller, more intentional ways that feel safer to them. Because now approaching doesn't feel like stepping into pressure. It feels like stepping into space that hasn't already been emotionally consumed. And for the first time, they don't feel like they are entering something that will demand more than they are ready to give. And this recalibration stage is where things start to feel confusing on the surface. Because the avoidant doesn't suddenly become expressive or emotionally available in the way people expect from typical romantic progressions. Instead, what you notice is something far more subtle, almost inconsistent, but deeply intentional on their side, even if they don't consciously realize it yet. They begin to return in fragments. A message here, a check-in there, a delayed response that carries more weight than it used to, because now every interaction is being measured against a new emotional baseline you've set without even announcing it. And the most important detail here is not the return itself, but the shift in tone behind it. It's quieter, less defensive, less reactive. The emotional walls don't fully disappear, but they stop feeling like a solid barrier and start feeling like something with small openings. What's really happening beneath that behavior is a slow internal contradiction forming. The avoidant part of them still expects pressure, still anticipates emotional demands, still prepares for the usual pattern of being needed too much. But each interaction you give them now fails to confirm that expectation. And when someone's nervous system keeps predicting intensity but keeps receiving calm, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that cannot be ignored forever. They may not label it, they may not analyze it in emotional language, but they feel it as a disruption in their usual relational rhythm. And that disruption is what begins to pull their attention back toward you in a more sustained way, not because they feel trapped, but because they can no longer fully categorize you. At this point, the emotional neutrality you maintained earlier begins to pay off in ways that are not immediately visible. You are no longer in the position of someone trying to be chosen. Instead, you are in the position of someone who is simply present without excess emotional leakage. And presence without need is one of the most psychologically disarming states for an avoidant, because it removes their primary justification for distance. They can't clearly label you as overwhelming, they can't easily dismiss you as emotionally demanding, and they can't fully detach without feeling the absence of something they don't yet have words for. So they stay in this in-between space longer than they normally would, observing more than reacting, engaging more than disappearing completely, but still not fully surrendering control. This is also where the idea of emotional identity shift becomes critical, because the dynamic is no longer just about communication style. It is about how you are now being stored in their mind. Earlier, you may have been categorized as emotionally expressive, reactive, or even predictable in your needs. But now that label doesn't fit anymore. And when someone can't categorize you, they unconsciously start to monitor you more closely. Not out of fear, but out of recalibration. They are trying to update their internal model of who you are. And that process naturally increases attention without requiring effort from your side. And ironically, the less you try to define yourself in their perception, the more space they have to define you in a way that feels compelling to them. And this is where the final layer of controlled detachment becomes the quiet anchor of the entire transformation. Because at no point is this about becoming cold or emotionally unavailable in a performative way. It is about removing the emotional urgency that once shaped your responses. When urgency disappears, the interaction changes texture. It becomes less about reaction and more about intention, less about proving connection and more about allowing it to form without interference. And in that environment, avoidants don't feel pursued, they feel invited. And that distinction is everything, because pursuit triggers withdrawal, but invitation creates choice. And choice is something they are far more willing to explore. By this stage, even their smallest actions carry different meaning. A delayed reply is no longer just avoidance, it becomes part of a pattern you are no longer emotionally destabilized by. A brief message is no longer a setback. It is a sign of engagement within their capacity. And your lack of overreaction to these small movements becomes the very thing that sustains their return. Because now they are not just interacting with you, they are interacting with a version of you that does not collapse when they step back. And that stability is unfamiliar enough to keep their attention anchored longer than before, even if they still resist fully stepping forward. And somewhere in this quiet recalibration, the dynamic stops feeling like push and pull and starts feeling like something slower, more deliberate, more psychologically layered. The urgency fades, the emotional noise reduces, and what remains is a connection that is no longer driven by anxiety on either side, but by measured curiosity and controlled presence. And this is exactly the point where everything you've been building toward begins to set the stage for the final transformation, where the emotional pattern either stabilizes into something real or dissolves completely, but either way, it is no longer controlled by old habits of chasing or escaping. And when that old cycle of chasing and escaping finally loses its grip, what emerges is something most people mistake for emotional distance, but it's actually emotional reset. Because now the connection is no longer being driven by survival responses. No more "don't lose them" panic. No more "I need to pull away before it gets too close" reflex. Instead, both sides, especially the avoidant side, start operating in a quieter internal environment where reactions slow down and interpretation becomes more thoughtful than instinctive. And this is where the real transformation hides, not in dramatic confessions or sudden vulnerability, but in the absence of chaos. Because for someone who has lived most of their relational life in push-pull tension, calm consistency doesn't feel boring at first, it feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar is exactly what forces attention. At this stage, something very subtle happens in the avoidant mind. They start to associate your presence with emotional stability instead of emotional demand. And that association is not built through words, but through repeated experience of you not overreacting, not escalating, not collapsing into emotional urgency when things slow down. That creates a new internal expectation, where interacting with you no longer automatically triggers defense. Instead, it becomes something they can approach without bracing for impact. And once someone no longer has to brace themselves before engaging with you, their natural tendency to withdraw weakens. Not because they've been convinced, but because the emotional environment no longer requires protection. But here's where the deeper layer of the three-word shift fully reveals itself. Because by now, the words themselves are not the story anymore. The transformation is. Those words only work because they are delivered from a completely different emotional state than before. If the same words were said with neediness, they would collapse immediately in meaning. But when they come from grounded detachment, they carry a completely different psychological weight. They don't ask, they don't plead, they don't chase. They simply exist as a reflection of someone who is no longer trying to hold on to something at all costs. And that absence of grasping energy is what creates space for the avoidant to lean in without feeling trapped. And this is where most people misunderstand the entire dynamic. They assume the goal is to make the avoidant commit faster, open up quicker, or respond more consistently. But what actually happens when this shift is done correctly is much more indirect. The goal is not to force closeness, it is to remove the internal reasons for distance. Because avoidants don't withdraw from connection itself. They withdraw from emotional pressure, expectation overload, and perceived loss of autonomy. When those triggers are no longer present, what remains is a person who is simply deciding, in their own time, how close they want to be. And that is the only space where genuine connection can form without resistance. As this unfolds further, you begin to notice something even more interesting. Their communication starts to carry micro-signals of investment. Not declarations, not emotional speeches, but subtle signs, slightly more effort in responses, slightly more consistency in check-ins, slightly more presence in conversations that used to feel one-sided. And because you are no longer emotionally over-invested in each interaction, you are able to see these shifts clearly without over-interpreting them or destabilizing your own emotional state. That stability on your side becomes the anchor that holds the entire dynamic together, because it prevents the old cycle from restarting. And then comes the final psychological shift, the one that quietly defines whether this connection stabilizes or dissolves. Internal reclassification. At some point, the avoidant stops seeing you as someone they need to manage emotionally and starts seeing you as someone they can actually be around without losing themselves. That might sound simple, but for their attachment system, it is profound. Because most of their distance patterns are not about lack of feeling, they are about fear of losing control in emotionally intense environments. When that fear is no longer activated, the emotional space between you stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a choice. And from here, everything becomes quieter but more meaningful. The connection no longer relies on highs and lows, no longer depends on emotional spikes to prove its existence. Instead, it begins to exist in steady, understated moments where presence itself becomes the strongest signal. And that is where the real conclusion of this entire psychological shift sits. Not in winning someone over, not in changing who they are, but in becoming someone who no longer participates in the old emotional pattern that kept pushing them away in the first place. Because once that pattern is gone, what remains is not pursuit, not escape, but possibility, and possibility is the only place where something real can ever begin to stay.